In the spring of 2021, I rode my bike almost 700 miles from Seattle, Washington to the California border. Everything that I needed for almost 3 weeks was contained on my bike, including this sketchbook and some travel watercolors and colored pencils. I thought it'd be fun to flip through this book and I could tell you a little bit about that trip. All right, let's go to the flat lay. So before we get started with the sketchbook, I thought I would do a little bit of backstory about how this trip came to be. We have to go back to February of 2020, which is when I had a bone marrow transplant to treat my acute leukemia. It's a long story, but basically for all of 2020, I had zero immune system. I was pretty sick and still recovering from all of the cancer treatments, so my life was pretty slow for a little while there. I pretty much just watercolored and rode my bike, trying to get strong. I couldn't really gather with any of my friends indoors, so to socialize with people, I would go on bike rides with them. Cycling became like a really big part of my life. I feel like when you say cycling, a lot of people picture like Lance Armstrong Tour de France, like serious cycling, but what I mean when I say cycling is mostly just bike rides. So during 2020 and the beginning of 2021, I was pretty much exclusively in my house if I wasn't outside cycling, and the only things I was doing were working on the last year of my undergrad that I did completely online, and then working on art and sharing that on my art Instagram. And that's really when I started drawing and painting more seriously and on a more regular basis, and I started making my own watercolor sketchbooks like this. It's just a simple Coptic stitch book with Canson XL watercolor paper inside. So right around the time that I was set to graduate from college, which was the spring of 2021, the COVID vaccine came out and I was starting to get healthier, and I really wanted to take a really big trip. International travel was still off the table, and I didn't feel comfortable staying inside, like in hotels or Airbnbs. Then also around this time, I was really into watching these YouTube videos of people who were doing bike tours, mostly on the west coast of the US via trains, like via the Amtrak. The same day that I got my COVID vaccine, I went out and purchased a 1980s steel mountain bike from a guy on Craigslist. Our plan was loosely that we were going to bike the Oregon coast. How we were going to get there, we didn't really know, so we bought these bikes and then we bought train tickets on the Amtrak from Whitefish, Montana to Seattle, Washington. I decided that I was going to make a sketchbook specifically for the trip, and it ended up being this one. I decided that I wanted to do watercolor paper. In retrospect, this is not the best book for what I was trying to accomplish, and I brought way too many art supplies. But yeah, let's just get into the sketchbook and we can talk about the trip as it unfolds in the pages. This little astronaut guy is not my usual aesthetic direction, but I feel like it encapsulates how I was feeling at the time, kind of untethered, and it was a very weird time for me. I know it was a weird time for a lot of people, so I have my little COVID vaccine sticker in the front here, and this is a little sketch of a Clark's Nutcracker. I was really into birds at the time. This was before we had set out for the trip. We were doing a lot of writing to prepare, and so this was a sketch that I made while on a bike ride up to Highlight Reservoir, which is outside of Bozeman where we were living at the time, and some Clark's Nutcrackers, which are all around Montana. These are just kind of some sandhill cranes and this long boy who I still feel a fondness towards. All right, so this was the first day of the bike trip. On our way up to Whitefish, we stopped at the Garden of 1000 Buddhas in Arley, Montana. It is a kind of odd place for this Buddhist shrine. Leslie and Rory, which are our friends' parents who live in Whitefish, made us a delicious snack, and we packed up our bike and headed to town. We saw a bald eagle, we got tacos, and rode around Whitefish before getting on the train. We got a sleeper car on the Amtrak that was snug but comfy. The train from Whitefish to Seattle is about 12 hours. It wasn't necessary that we got a sleeper car, but it definitely made a big difference. A lot of this is done with Tombow brush markers. May 8th, we got off the train in Seattle and got lattes and rode our bikes through the insane city traffic on a big hill on Broadway. Our friends Daniel and Sabin live in Seattle and generously hosted us. We hung out around Seattle and then drove to Bellingham and got Thai food, and these are some objects from Daniel's parents' house. The next day was Sunday, and our friends dropped us off in Anacortes. We took the ferry to San Juan Island and stayed in this little bay. The day that we saw the fox, we were riding up this hill. All these photographers were crouched on the side of the road, and we're like, what are they looking at? We look over and there's a little baby fox in a ditch. And for some reason, it was the first real day of riding, and it was so beautiful on the San Juan Islands that I just like burst into tears when I saw this little baby fox. It was just like a very memorable moment for me. And I made this little watercolor and marker sketch of the beach by our campsite. These are some little specimens that I found around our campsite. Monday, May 10th, we rode to Roche Harbor where I got a job offer and a BLT. So I had applied to a bunch of nonprofit jobs before we had left, and one of them called me back while I was on the trip and offered me a job, which was pretty memorable. I ended up really hating that job and not working there for very long, but it was fun that I got the offer while on the trip. Then I did this little boat drawing that I still really like from Spencer Spit on Lopez Island. This is a little quote that I wrote from the info sign. I was really inspired by all these signs that we saw along the way. It was really fun to not be in a car, be in a bike, and be able to stop and really like read these little road signs. And traveling by bike just puts you at a completely different pace than being in a car, so I feel like I took in a lot more information like that. Somewhere along the way I purchased a little bird guide, and these are some of the birds that I drew from the guide. We drank beer on the dock while an otter teased us. Okay, I totally forgot about this. We were on this dock and it had this like grate situation, and this little otter was underneath the grate trying to get us to give him our snacks. This campsite has ice cream and snacks, perfect for our chill day. Still biked up a massive hill to get here. And then this is a sketch that I did of the East Sound on Orcas Island. I still really like this painting. I was pretty new at drawing landscapes in general, and then also just working from life is a totally different experience. I remember I got really sunburned doing this. It took a lot longer than I thought. I had like a strip from my leggings to my sock where I just got super sunburned. On the San Juan Islands, this was kind of our intro to riding our bikes, trying to get used to all of our camp gear. So it was really nice to have these short, low effort days. We were only doing 15 or 20 miles of riding in a day and eating at really fancy restaurants and stuff for breakfast, which was probably my favorite part of the whole trip. This is a little sketch of Taylor sitting at Crescent Lake, which is in Fairholme, Washington. We almost missed the ferry to Anacortes where my aunt picked us up, and she made us tortilla soup and we took luxurious showers at her house. At this point you can see I started writing the miles that we rode in a day. The Olympic Discovery Trail is really cool. We didn't really know that this was going to be a thing until we got there, and it was just like this gorgeous bike trail. We had been riding just on the road at this point, so being on a bike trail felt really luxurious. And then we stayed at this place called Dungeness Spit where we had a super cool campsite on the bluff. Shout out to Sue and her friend for the hookup. Oh yeah, so Sue, it was a Friday night, so the campground was really full, and this lady just was like, hey, you guys can camp in our site if you want to. So that was really appreciated. The entire trip we had really great luck with camping. It was mid-May, so not like peak of the summer season. I think later in the year you might have some trouble, but since we didn't have a car with us, it was really easy to just be like, hey, can we camp right here? Or a lot of the time we just kind of stealth camp. Then we rode to Crescent Lake on the trail, which was the biggest day we had done yet at 55 miles. This is the Bogachiel River, which is just outside of Forks, Washington. So if you're a big, Twilight fan, you know about Forks. And I drew this little American Dipper that I was seeing while I was sitting down by this little creek. We rode up a huge hill on 101 first thing in the morning, but we were surprised by the Olympic Discovery Trail once again and rode mostly alone on trails all the way to Sappho. Then we had to get back on the highway in Forks where we had lunch at a diner. I wrote, it feels like we've been riding a lot of days in a row at this point. Both of us have pretty sore butts. Yeah, so we were riding a lot before the trip, but there's just like no way that you can really get your butt in shape for this amount of riding. I wrote, it really feels like a rainforest now. Everything is so green and so lush. We rode from Bogachiel to Amanda Park, stopped at several beaches along the way. Ruby Beach was deemed spectacular by the guidebook and did not disappoint. So we did have a guidebook, but we weren't following any sort of predetermined route. We just were kind of looking at where the campsites were in these guidebooks that we got. I will link those guidebooks in the description. They were sort of helpful, but it was really fun also to just use Google Maps and AllTrails to kind of figure out where we were going. But Ruby Beach is like one of the most beautiful beaches in Washington. The last 20 miles of riding this day, it was pouring rain, so we ended up staying in a motel, which was the first time that we had stayed indoors in like a week. This is a white-crowned sparrow. I was very into birds around this time. The next day we rode from Amanda Park to Aberdeen, which is the home of Kurt Cobain. I remember the whole time we were listening to Andrew Bird. Taylor and I each had an AirPod in, And so we were trying to stay close enough to each other that the Bluetooth wouldn't disconnect from the headphones, which was actually kind of nice because you could put your head down and ride, and then if the Bluetooth started getting spotty, you would pick up your head and either look behind you or in front of you and see that the other person wasn't very close. If you don't know, Andrew Bird is like beautiful violin music, and it was sort of rainy and very ethereal. I wrote, it felt like we were in a Miyazaki movie. This is a sketch that I did of Nehalem Bay, which is where we had our first layover day. I did some more like kind of journaling here. I'm not going to read every single thing to you, but riding from Bruceport to Astoria, there is a massive bridge across the Columbia. It's 4 miles and there isn't a bike lane. So that was definitely one of the sketchiest times on the trip. We had to really psych ourselves up for it and basically ride for 4 miles as fast as we could without stopping over the Columbia with tons of cars and trucks passing us with like barely any shoulder. But it was fun that we had officially biked from Washington to Oregon at this point. I wrote that I bought a new handlebar bag and a latte. We ate really well on this trip. We basically stopped for breakfast, lunch, and dinner the entire time. I wrote, we briefly had beef, which means that Taylor and I fought about something. It's to be expected on a trip like this that you'll fight with whoever you're with, but especially if they're your romantic partner. I feel like there is just so many opportunities to have beef, but Taylor and I really got along the whole time. It was just funny that I wrote down, we briefly had beef. This is probably my favorite spread of the entire book. It's these little sandpipers and this landscape from Whalen Island. I just can remember so vividly what it felt like to be here. And I think that's the most special part about keeping a sketchbook like this is just your memories when you draw things, you're observing in such a different way, and it just really sinks in so much deeper. We rode through misty rain, dairy cows, we had oysters, and we were riding through these beautiful sand dunes. We're in these sand dunes. I wrote rain, 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 and bike problems, which is when I drew this.
I would describe my mood right now as damp.
This is really the only mechanical issue we had the entire time. The shifter on my bike, it had been pouring rain for several days in a row, and some dirt and sand and stuff had gotten into the shifter, so every time that I tried to shift up, my bike would just shift all the way back down. So we ended up quitting early that day and fixing my bike with some JB weld. It felt appropriate on this day to do a sort of detailed drawing of my bike. I feel like I got really comfortable with the components of a bike. Bikes are kind of notoriously hard to draw, but I feel like I executed this really well because I was so familiar with my bike at this point. And yeah, my bike was a Panasonic M400, which is an 80s mountain bike. These steel mountain bikes are really popular for bike tours because you can fit a rear rack on them and they're just really durable. This spread is from Sunset Bay State Park. So we rode 59 miles and then 73 miles. At this point, we were starting to feel pretty in shape. And 73 miles might sound like a lot, but when you have the entire day to do it, it really didn't feel that bad. I do remember being very tired at the end of this day. And then we rode from Sunset Bay to Humbug Mountain, Oregon, which is in southern Oregon. And this was the last campsite that we camped at. And at the time, I really hated this landscape, but now that I look at it, it's quite charming. I remember so vividly the sunset, again, just having the intention to paint things really made me observe the world in a different way, and I'm so glad that I have this memory. We rode from Humbug Mountain to the California border, which is where my parents, who live near Sacramento in California, picked us up and took us to their house. We woke up in Crescent City, went to Jedediah Smith Redwoods. Those are some big fucking trees. That's what I wrote. The rest of the sketchbook is just like a traditional sketchbook, some arrow leaf balsam root. These are done with gouache and colored pencil. Just a random swatch page, this bird, my parents' dog, Asher, some more like journaling. This is not as relevant. These birds, which I still think are very charming. Some more birds, some more balsam root, this time just in gouache. And then this is us back in Montana. So we rode the train from Sacramento to Whitefish and then picked up our car and headed home. The reason why we chose to ride the train was basically because we could take our bikes on it pretty easily, and I had never taken the Amtrak before. If you are from the West Coast, trains are not a big part of our life unless you live in like a major metropolitan area, so it was really fun to take the train, but I feel like this represents the vibe when we got back home. Taylor listening to music, laying on our bed in our tiny apartment, and we were just so tired for quite a while after the trip. It was a big endeavor and we felt really proud of ourselves at the end. And then the last couple pages here are just some like weird ephemera that I have put in here. This is our Amtrak ticket, the little bicycle. I'm glad that I kept this. It's pretty cute. And then these are some little maps that I got of the San Juan Islands, and I did a little map of our route here, the ferry ticket, and then this was our route in Washington. I did little circles of where we stayed. The last page is just some little swatches, and that's it. It's a pretty thick book. In the future, if I ever go on another trip like this, I will definitely be bringing something smaller because I had to get this out of my bags every time that I wanted to draw. Almost 3 years later, my process is a lot different, my life is a lot different, so it's fun to revisit this as a little time capsule of my life at the time and the trip. If you have any questions about bike touring or bike packing this specific trip, I will try to answer them in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you liked it. I hope it inspired you, made you want to go plan a fun trip of your own. If you like this video, maybe you could subscribe to the channel, give it a like, or comment down below and we can talk about bikes, birds, books. I also have a Patreon where I share exclusive content every single month, including sketchbook scans that never get posted anywhere else, and longer format real-time videos of me drawing and sketching and talking about my process. I'm Little Tiny Egg everywhere on the internet, so come find me, and I hope you have a really great day. Okay, bye.